James Bond, Showdown with Scaramanga. Before I get into my stride, I'd like to mention that I produced another video about James Bond called James Bond's Housekeeper, which you might like to have a look at when you finish viewing this one. Both of my James Bond videos deal with the Bond of Ian Fleming's novels, not the Bond of the films. The James Bond books give the real Bond, the three-dimensional Bond who is a genuinely interesting human being. I'd like to give thanks and credit at the start of my talk to two people. One is the old friend of mine from university days who once gave me, for a birthday present, my one and only first edition of any book. And here it is. Now, isn't that a beautiful dust jacket picture? The James Bond book I've just shown you is the one I'm going to be dealing with in this video, The Man with the Golden Gun, Fleming's last novel and my personal favourite. The other person I'm going to thank is an ex-pupil of mine with whom I had a very interesting email exchange recently discussing the fight scenes, not in The Man with the Golden Gun or any other James Bond novel, but in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, discussing in particular the way the fights were done in two very well-known film versions of the play, the 1960s film directed by Franco Zeffirelli and the 1990s one by Baz Luhrmann. In the former of these, the Zeffirelli, the fight scenes are, as in Shakespeare's text, sword fights. But Luhrmann's modern, futuristic version turns these into gunfights. Now, I'm a strong advocate of sword fights so far as Romeo and Juliet's concerned, but I can definitely see the merits of a gunfight in other fictional situations. And I have my ex-pupil to thank for inspiring me to consider a gunfight from my favourite James Bond novel as the subject for this video. In The Man with the Golden Gun, James Bond is given a mission to kill a man called Francisco Scaramanga, a freelance assassin who has murdered and maimed a number of British and American Secret Service agents. Scaramanga, whose nickname is Pistols, and whose main weapon is a gold-plated, long-barreled Colt 45, is a top marksman with a lightning-fast draw, and, very importantly, he is utterly merciless, prepared to kill with no hesitation or compunction whatsoever. The episode I want to look at comes near the end of The Man with the Golden Gun, following a chapter where Bond has already been in a gunfight on a train with Scaramanga and several of his henchmen, in the course of which both Scaramanga and Bond have been wounded. Both men have leapt off the train at different points on its journey in order to save themselves as the train is heading for a terrible crash. Bond finds himself in a piece of extensive swampland and sets off in search of Scaramanga. Bond's wound, a flesh wound in his shoulder, is not a severe one, but he's in pain and has lost blood, as well as being exhausted from what he's just gone through and from the tropical heat of the swamp. He is very much not at his best, but he knows that he must find Scaramanga and finish him off. After a while, Bond locates his man, lying in a clearing, stretched out with his back propped against some mango roots. Scaramanga does not see Bond at first, as Bond is crouched in the bush surrounding the clearing, but Bond can see him and silently observes him for a minute or two. Scaramanga's right side is covered with blood, and he's clearly been wounded much more seriously than Bond has been. But it's obvious to Bond that Scaramanga's still a very dangerous enemy, as shown by the way that Scaramanga deals with the approach of a large snake, watching it intently and then killing it with a knife at exactly the moment it comes close enough. I'll read an extract from the account that deals with this. Not a muscle moved in Scaramanga's face. Only the eyes were dead steady, watchful slits. The snake came into the shadow of his trouser leg and moved slowly up towards the glistening shirt. Suddenly, the tongue of steel that lay across Scaramanga's stomach came to life and leapt. It transfixed the head of the snake exactly in the centre of the brain and pierced through it, pinning it to the ground and holding it there while the powerful body thrashed wildly until the death struggles diminished and finally ceased altogether. Bond, who's silently observing the scene, cannot help but be hugely impressed by Scaramanga's courage, coolness, and deadly efficiency as a fighter. Bond has clear evidence before him that Scaramanga, though badly wounded, is still a formidable opponent, primed to kill anything that threatens him, and determined to survive at all costs. As Bond watches Scaramanga busily occupied in cutting the flesh of the snake into pieces and eating it, Scaramanga's survival instincts drive him to do this. As Bond watches, what he should do is draw his gun and finish Scaramanga off. It would be the work of a moment to do so, and it could be done easily, without Scaramanga being aware of a thing, as Bond is an excellent shot and is quite close to his target. Bond, however, does not do this. Instead, he emerges from cover, gun in hand, and engages Scaramanga in conversation for several minutes, in the course of which he tells him that he intends to kill him. Of course, though Bond does indeed intend to put an end to Scaramanga, and as painlessly and quickly as possible with a well-aimed fatal shot, he's not proceeding quickly at all. And the underlying reason for this lack of speed is Bond's deep-seated reluctance to kill a badly wounded man in cold blood. Killing in hot blood in the course of a fight, especially when his opponent has struck first, is a different matter. But Fleming's Bond, for all his physical and mental toughness, is a man whose essential humanity recoils from ruthless actions. A man who sees cold-blooded killing, even if authorised by the special demands of his job, as akin to murder. After some minutes have passed, however, Bond senses that his vitality and resolve are draining away, and despite the horror he feels at what he's about to do, he steels himself to the task, bringing both hands into the two-handed grip of the target shooter and telling Scaramanga that his moment has come. It's at this point that Scaramanga appears to drop the sneering defiance and bravado that he's shown so far in conversing with Bond, and asks, rather plaintively, for time to say a prayer, as he tells Bond that he's a Catholic. And Bond, the man who's licensed to kill but deeply reluctant to kill in cold blood, gives his victim a minute for his final devotions. I think this is a particularly telling moment, illustrative of the outlook of a quite common type of Englishman, the man without religious belief himself, but aware that someone with a different upbringing and cultural norms might well see things quite differently. Bond knows that Scaramanga, for all his murderous lifestyle, comes from a culture where Catholicism is, as it were, in the blood. Bond is a world away from being a Catholic himself, but he has the open-mindedness and tolerance to allow this rather exotic enemy his last wish. I'm going to finish my video talk by reading the finale to the episode, the finale that provides the showdown between James Bond and Francisco Pistols Scaramanga. Before I read it, you need to know that Bond believes Scaramanga to be unarmed. Scaramanga does not have his famous long-barreled Colt 45 with him, and the knife he used earlier has been thrown to the ground between the two men. And there's something else you need to be aware of in the passage you're about to hear, which is that Fleming tells us that Scaramanga's final prayers are in Latin, reflecting the practice before the Second Vatican Council got to work. Scaramanga's use of Latin, watch out for the phrase hypnotic litany. Scaramanga's use of Latin is, I think, significant in creating the distinctive atmosphere of the episode. Here we go. Scaramanga's hands went up to his face and covered his eyes. There came a drone of Latin which went on and on. Bond stood there in the sunshine, his gun lowered, watching Scaramanga, but at the same time not watching him, the edge of his focus dulled by the pain and the heat and the hypnotic litany that came from behind the shuttered face, and the horror of what Bond was going to have to do. In 1 minute, perhaps 2. The fingers of Scaramanga's right hand crawled imperceptibly sideways across his face, inch by inch, centimetre by centimetre. They got to his ear and stopped. The drone of the Latin prayer never altered its slow, lulling tempo. And then the hand leapt behind the head, and the tiny golden derringer roared, and James Bond spun round as if he'd taken a right to the jaw, and crashed to the ground. At once, Scaramanga was on his feet and moving forward like a swift cat. He snatched up the discarded knife and held it forward like a tongue of silver flame. But James Bond twisted like a dying animal on the ground, and the iron in his hand cracked viciously again and again, 5 times, and then fell out of his hand onto the black earth as his gun hand went to the right side of his belly and stayed there, clutching at the terrible pain. Scaramanga stood for a moment and looked up at the deep blue sky. His fingers opened in a spasm and let go the knife. His pierced heart stuttered and limped and stopped. He crashed flat back and lay, his arms flung wide, as if someone had thrown him away. Thank you for listening.